Did you know there is an entire film genre that was originally built on shocking the viewer and revealing what's usually hidden? This genre is called Mondo, and it emerged in Italy in the early 1960s. It all began with the film Mondo Cane, which became the starting point and set the tone for the entire genre. Later, such films became known as documentaries, documentaries that emphasize harsh, provocative, and sometimes shocking footage. The essence of the genre is that it shows reality without embellishment, or creates a very strong illusion of it. This can include scenes of violence, disasters, unusual customs, or the extremes of life. Sometimes these are real shots, and sometimes they are staged, but presented in such a way that the viewer no longer knows what is true and what is not. It was this sense of the forbidden that made the genre popular. People wanted to see what was usually left behind the scenes, but almost immediately controversy arose over the line between documentary and exploitation. To understand how it all began and why this genre continues to generate so much discussion, we need to go back to the very first film that gave it its name. Now let's go back to the very beginning, to the film that started it all. In 1962, three directors, Gualtiero Jacopetti, Franco Prosperi, and Paolo Cavara released Mondo Cane. And at the time, it seemed like something completely new. Not a classic documentary, nor a typical film, but a mixture that deliberately presses the viewer and forces them to look at things they usually turn away from. Each of them had their own background. Jacopetti was a journalist with a provocative style that knew how to captivate audience. Prosperi was a cameraman who had worked in Africa and witnessed real-life conflict. And Cavara had a background in scientific and ethnographic filmmaking. All of this combined produced a very strange yet powerful result. The film itself is a collection of episodes from around the world. There's no unifying plot, no characters to follow, you simply seem to jump from one reality to another. And each subsequent scene can be even more unexpected. And this is where the truly gripping parts begin. For example, scenes of the mass extermination of stray dogs, the camera never turns away. It records the process as it happens. Or footage of a slaughterhouse where animals are slaughtered industrially, without editing, without softening. Everything is presented as directly as possible. There are scenes featuring tribal rituals, strange, unfamiliar to Western audiences. There are scenes where people eat insects or animals that are considered normal in another culture, but seem outlandish to the audience. And then there is an abrupt shift to Western subcultures, which are also presented as if they were strange and even absurd. And it's this contrast that keeps the film constantly tense. You never know what's coming next, whether it's something shocking, strange, or simply uncomfortable to watch. But things aren't so simple. Over time, questions began to arise. Was everything shown truly a pure documentary? Some critics claimed that certain scenes could have been staged or deliberately enhanced by editing. The directors themselves denied this, but acknowledged that they selected the most brutal and gripping moments. And the most interesting thing is that the film became a huge hit. It was seen around the world, and its music even received an Oscar nomination. This was a signal to the entire industry. Audiences are willing to watch even the most difficult things if they are told it is reality. And it was from this point that the genre began to grow. With each new film, it became more brutal, bolder, and more controversial. Following the success of Mondo Cane, the directors didn't just continue, they dramatically upped the ante. In 1966, Africa Audio was released, and this time it wasn't a collection of strange customs, but a true story of the collapse of colonialism in Africa, complete with war, chaos, and real death. Filming took place directly in conflict zones: Kenya, Congo, and Tanzania. This isn't a reconstruction, not a staged production. The camera actually captures the events that unfolded at that moment. And that's what makes the film so powerful. The footage depicts the aftermath of ethnic clashes, deserted villages, bodies left behind after attacks, chaos that seems uncontrollable. There are scenes depicting the mass extermination of animals, for example, footage of herds of wild animals being shot from vehicles. The camera calmly, without commentary, recording the scene. But the most talked about part is the execution scene. The camera at a distance, people are lined up, comments are heard, and then everything happens in real time, without cuts, without distractions. This is not a hint, not a reconstruction, it is direct observation. And here the main question arises: were they simply filming it, or did they present somehow influence what was happening? Critics claimed the film crew may have made deals with the military to gain access to such scenes, that they were allowed into areas normally off limits for filming. The directors denied this, saying they were merely documenting events, but they themselves admitted they chose the most violent and shocking moments. The film's release sparked a major controversy. It was accused of racial bias, of presenting events one-sidedly, and of amplifying chaos and violence for effect. An investigation was launched in Italy, and in other countries the film was either heavily cut or banned outright. But, and this is important, the film was a success. People watched it, and it ultimately cemented Mondo's reputation as a genre unafraid to depict real death. After all this criticism, the directors slightly changed their approach in the next film, but the principle remained the same: show what others try not to show, and do it as harshly as possible. After all the controversies surrounding Africa Audio, it seemed there was nowhere else to go, but Giacopelli and Prosperi decided not to simply continue. They went even farther and completely changed their approach. In 1971, Addio Zio Tom was released, and this time we're not dealing with actual footage, but a completely staged film. But it's shot as if it were a genuine documentary from the past, as if the camera had actually been transported to the era of slavery and was simply recording the events without interference. Filming took place in Haiti. They built massive sets, used hundreds of extras, and recreated the atmosphere of the 18th and 19th centuries. The dirt, the hate, the crowds, the scream, it all looks less like a movie, and more like you're watching footage that shouldn't even exist. And here's where the hardest part begins. The film features scenes of slave actions. People are let out, examined like merchandise, their bodies, teeth, and physical condition discussed. The camera never pulls away, never softens, it seems to deliberately linger on these moments, making the viewer feel uncomfortable. There are scenes of punishment, long, drawn-out ones, without any montage rescues. Humiliation, complete deprivation of dignity, and an atmosphere of fear are depicted. In some scenes, you get the feeling you are not watching a film but observing something happening in reality right now. And it's precisely because of this presentation that the film is particularly difficult to perceive, because the mind understands it's staged, but visually and emotionally, it feels like reality. In the US, the reaction was extremely harsh. Protests erupted, particularly from African American organizations. The main question was something like this: is this an attempt to show the horror of history, or is it being exploited for shock value? Critics said the directors were deliberately blurring the line between condemnation and exploitation, that the film doesn't give the viewer distance, doesn't explain, doesn't analyze. It simply shows, and does so in the most realistic manner possible. In some countries, the film was cut, and in others, its release was restricted, but the debate around it continued. It became one of the most controversial projects of its time. And it was after Adiozzi o Tom that Jacoperi and Prosperi finally cemented their reputation as directors willing to push the envelope even if it caused the creators discomfort to the audience. If Mondo had previously played on the edge of documentary, by 1980 that edge had all but disappeared. Director Ruggero Deodato released Cannibal Holocaust, no longer just a provocation, but a film that literally shatters our perception of reality. The plot follows a group of documentary filmmakers who go into the Amazon jungle and disappear. Their films are later discovered, and the viewer feels as if they were watching what they filmed before their deaths. It seems familiar now, but back then, the idea of found footage was something new and deeply terrifying. The film was deliberately shot as dirty and realistically as possible, shaky camera, jerky movements, the feeling that this isn't a movie but a real recording that no one was supposed to see. And the farther you watch, the more the feeling that it's even staged disappears. And here's where the most brutal moments begin. There are scenes in the film that look so realistic that the viewer literally can tell if it's acting or not. For example, the scene with the turtle being butchered right there on camera, or other scenes with animals. The scariest thing is these aren't special effects, these are real scenes. But that wasn't the only real blow. After the premiere, rumors began swirling that the actors might have actually died during filming. These rumors were so convincing that Italian police confiscated the film and Deodato himself was arrested. He was accused of making a true snuff film that is a film featuring real murders. Imagine the shock: the film is released and a short time later, the director is accused of murdering his own crew. The situation went to court. To prove the actors were alive, they had to be literally brought into the courtroom. Their contract prohibited them from appearing in public. This was done deliberately to enhance the realism effect. Ultimately, the murder charges were dropped, but the story didn't end there. Deodato still faced animal cruelty charges, a fact no one denied. The film was banned or restricted in many countries, including the UK and Australia. Some banned it entirely, while others released it heavily edited. But the most interesting thing is that despite all of this, the film became a cult classic. It had a profound influence on future horror films, especially the found footage format, which would later become very popular. And in fact, it's one of the most striking examples of how far cinema can go when it tries to appear too real. While previous films attempted to shock through real events or their imitation, Faces of Death went even farther. It began to play with the viewer's perception itself. In 1978, this film, directed by John Alan Schwartz under the pseudonym Conan Lecellier, was released in the United States. At first glance, it seemed like a simple documentary about death, but in reality, it's a mixture of real footage and staging, making the viewer completely unable to discern which is true. The film doesn't have a coherent plot. It's a collection of scenes, each depicting death in a different form, and is presented with extreme coldness, without emotion, as if it were a scientific study. But it's precisely this calm tone that makes everything even more terrifying.
К сожалению, медицине не всегда удается спасти жизнь пациента. И когда наступает смерть, начинается моя работа.
It shows autopsies in the morgue, cold, lifeless bodies being cut open right in front of camera. There are also shots of car crashes, mangled cars, the aftermath of impacts. There are scenes of animal attacks, executions, and of course one of the most talked about sequences, the scene with the monkey. According to the film's narrative, a group of people in a restaurant allegedly eat the brain of a live monkey. The camera films everything in close-up without painting or softening. For audiences at the time, it looked so real that many were convinced it was a real recording. And here's the key point. Schwartz later admitted that a significant portion of the film was staged. That scene with the monkey was also staged, but the film did use actual archival footage of deaths and incidents. And it was the mixture of truth and fiction that made the film so terrifying. You can't tell when you're being deceived and when you're being shown the truth. The film was distributed primarily on VH, and this played a huge role. People passed it around, copied it, watched it on the sly. It became especially popular among teenagers, as something forbidden, something you can't watch but everyone wants to. Critics harshly attacked the film. They said it exploited real-life tragedies, depicted death without respect for people and their families, and was no longer a documentary but pure shock value for money. Yet the film was a success. It spawned sequels and effectively cemented the shockumentary format in the United States. Interestingly, unlike Cannibal Holocaust, there was no high-profile criminal case, but the film was part of a larger wave. In the 1980s saw a crackdown on dangerous video content. In the UK, for example, many such tapes were confiscated or banned from sale altogether. And the most telling thing is the author's own confession, when Schwartz openly admitted that a significant portion of the scenes were staged. It essentially saved him from serious accusations, but a bad taste remained. Because this film demonstrated a simple thing: if you present the material correctly, the viewer will believe almost anything. And that's precisely what makes projects like this truly unsettling. Over time, it became clear that such films weren't just shock content, but a huge risk zone from a legal and moral standpoint. Almost every similar project faced the same questions. For example, was it legal to show real footage of death? Did the relatives of the victims give consent? And in general, where is the line drawn between documentary filmmaking and exploitation of someone else's tragedy? Many films were accused of using real events without permission, taking footage out of context, or deliberately presenting it for effect. Age restrictions were also a separate issue. These films often fell into no particular category, too violent for general release, yet technically considered as a documentary. Over time, the rules began to tighten. Stricter laws were introduced regarding the depiction of violence, the use of archival footage, and especially animal protection. What could previously be filmed as is was later either banned or severely restricted. As a result, the genre found itself in a difficult situation. On the one hand, audience demand remained. On the other, producing and distributing such content became much more difficult. In fact, It was these very restrictions that gradually began to squeeze Mondo into a narrower niche where it could no longer exist as freely as before. Ultimately, Mondo and shockumentary films exemplify how far cinema can go when it attempts to show reality without filters. On the one hand, the audience was generally shown things that no one had dared to show before. Sometimes these were real shots, sometimes staged, but presented in such a way that the difference was barely noticeable. And that's precisely what made the genre so captivating. On the other hand, all of this was constantly controversial, because telling a story is one thing, and exploiting shock and other people's tragedies for effect is quite another. But whatever one might say, the influence of this genre is enormous. Many modern films, especially those in the found footage format, essentially grew out of these ideas. And today, Mondo is perceived as something highly controversial, even harsh and uncomfortable in places, but at the same time important for understanding how cinema can engage with reality.